Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's episode. Today, we'll talk about an interesting report that came from Palo Alto's Unit 42 research team. It's called the ASM threat report. It got launched in September 2023, mid of the month. This report is focused on ASM, attack surface management, and for those people who don't know what attack surface is, essentially it's the number of all possible points or attack vectors where an unauthorized user can access a system and extract data. Okay, the objective of any organization is to make sure that the attack surface is smaller and easier to protect. So, organizations typically track the assets that they know about and also the assets that they know about, and for that they deploy technologies like external attack surface management that continuously discover this unknown attack surface. I've done a specific episode on ASM earlier this year. I recommend everyone who doesn't know about ASM to go and look at that episode, both on my YouTube channel as well as the podcast. Now, going back to this report, the report includes some data from May 2020 to May 2023, and what Palo Alto did is they analyzed data of organizations. So they did this research on 250 organizations. Now let's look at the key findings from these reports. Okay, the report states that the attack surface is increasing simply because the cloud IT infra used by organizations across the world is evolving. It's always increasing and evolving. Okay, 80% of the security exposures were observed in the cloud environments, which means cloud is the dominant attack surface. Okay, now the report also found that the composition of new and existing services running in different cloud providers used by organizations over a period of 6 months. So what organizations are doing is they are continuously trying to take down new services, most of them, and trying to launch new services, and this often leads to attack surface. Also, the report states that over 45% of most organizations high risk cloud hosted exposures in a given month were observed on new services that were not present in these organizations attack surface in the month prior. So which means they're constantly trying new services. Okay, and also that nearly 95% of EOL software systems, which is end of life software systems exposed on the public internet of the organization, were found in the cloud environment. So which means that the organizations are too slow to retire outdated systems, or there's a possibility that developers find it easy to deploy older software on new cloud instances that they are launching. Okay, also over 75% of publicly accessible software development infrastructure exposures were found in cloud, making them attractive targets for attackers. Okay, so also the report found very interesting observations on the vulnerability intelligence side, and also exploit intelligence. What they found is that on an average, organizations typically take more than 3 weeks to investigate and remediate a critical exposure. So let's say there's a new vulnerability that's found, it's critical in nature. Organizations will follow their process, and it will take on an average, over 3 weeks to do something about that vulnerability. Okay, whereas attackers, what they are doing is they start exploiting vulnerabilities within hours of public disclosures, and the report contains some examples. So the report states that 3 of the 30 vulnerabilities that were exploited, so out of the 30 vulnerabilities that this report found, 3 of them were exploited within hours of CVE public disclosure. Okay, 19 of the 30 vulnerabilities were exploited within 12 weeks of the public disclosure, and also the report analyzed 15 remote code execution vulnerabilities actively used by ransomware operators. Okay, and 3 of these critical RC vulnerabilities were exploited within hours of disclosures, and 6 of these vulnerabilities were exploited within 8 weeks of publications. Okay, so attackers are moving at machine speed, organizations are not. Okay, the report also states that the most common organization risk around cloud exposures are frequent misconfiguration, shared responsibility, shadow ITs, inherent connection to the internet, as well as lack of visibility into cloud assets. The report also states that RDP is the most prevalent remote access service worldwide, accounting for over 40% of the exposed remote services. Okay. Now, 8 of the 9 industries that this report studied had internet accessible RDP server vulnerable to brute force attacks for at least 25% of the month, which means an organization launches a cloud instance, and at least for 1 week within a month, this server will have RDP enabled on an average. Okay. Also, in the last year report, where the research team analyzed over 600 incident response cases, they said 50% of these targeted organizations lacked MFA or multi-factor authentication on key internet-facing assets. And when you have RDP exposure and your MFA is not there, of course, it's easier for attackers to analyze, to compromise these systems. Okay. The report also gave a distribution of the various types of attacks. So let's look at that data. So 3 most common exposures led to 60% of the overall attack surface globally. Within those 3, 22% of the exposures were because of web framework takeover. So this includes insecure web versions of Apache web servers, insecure versions of PHP, insecure versions of jQuery accounts, etc. So with what that means is developers are deploying, they don't secure them, and these things are, of course, internet connected, and hence attackers are able to exploit them. The second category out of the 3 is 20% exposure is remote access services. So this includes things like RDP, which I mentioned earlier, SSH, and VNC, virtual network computing. These services, when they're compromised, they allow attackers to gain unauthorized access to an organization's network or systems, and potentially leads to financial losses, reputational damage, and other consequences. Okay. And by the way, RDP has been shown to be a leading vector for business interruption via ransomware. The third category of exposure was the 17% category, and this is around IT security and networking infrastructure. Essentially, these are internet accessible administrative pages of routers, firewalls, VPNs, and other core networking and security appliances. So administrators, I believe, would leave these critical infrastructure components open with the default login and password sometimes, and even if they're not default, they are internet facing. Okay. The other categories that were mentioned in this were file sharing exposure, which led to around 12% of exposures, and also data breaches. So this is essentially insecure FTPs or other file sharing services, and also sometimes misconfigured cloud storage. Okay. The report also mentions industry-wise data. So what they've done is they've taken around 10 or 12 industries. I'm not going to cover all of them, but I'm just going to talk for a few of them to make some points clear. So various industries have different kind of exposure data percentages, and it completely depends on how the employees in that organization are behaving or organizations are behaving. So for example, in high tech, 34% of exposures were on the IT security and network infrastructure services. Okay, remember the default login pages, internet facing code, security, networking devices, that category. The second category in high tech was remote access services with 31% exposure. The other industry, national government, 28% IT security and networking infrastructure, 23% file sharing, 23% databases. Okay, so it depends. So databases are not as high; they're at least not in 2 digits in the high tech. Okay, professional legal services, 50% of exposure because of file sharing, including unencrypted FTP servers, and 17% IT security and networking infrastructure. Healthcare vertical, 56% on the development infrastructure. It could be because healthcare as an industry is going through digital transformation. New tech is getting embedded in the various businesses within healthcare, and this could lead to developers leaving the infrastructure insecure by mistake. 18% in healthcare sector is IT security and networking infrastructure. Okay, and so on and so forth. So as you would have realized by now, different industries have different kind of exposures, but IT security and network infrastructure is most common, followed by FTP or file sharing based exposure, databases, etc. Okay, so for example, in legal and professional services, file sharing is a common thing. They work a lot of documentation, and hence 50% of the exposures were about file sharing. Okay, and then the report talks about manufacturing, retail, etc. Okay. So that's some industry specific data. Now, in terms of recommendation, what the report recommends is you have to achieve continuous visibility, which means essentially maintain a comprehensive real time understanding of all internet accessible assets, including cloud based systems and services. You should address cloud misconfiguration by regularly reviewing and updating cloud configuration, aligning with best practices, and foster collaboration between security and DevOps teams to secure cloud native application development and deployment. Okay. They should not launch new services without keeping security teams up to date. Also, prioritize remediation, focusing on addressing the most critical vulnerabilities and exposures, such as those with high CVSS score, which accounts for severity, and exploit prediction scoring system EPSS score, which accounts for likelihood to reduce the chances of successful cyber attacks. Okay. Now, my takeaway, the most interesting part I found is the stark difference in the speed at which attackers operate versus the organization, specifically on the vulnerability part. Okay, so I believe there should be a way where organizations should focus on automatic remediation of these critical vulnerabilities that have high CVSS and high EPSS scores. Okay. Also, continuously scan your external attack surface. If you have a large digital presence, and if you are involving developers, which I believe most organizations are, so that's my understanding. Okay. With that, thank you so much. I'll see you next time.